was Billy Bishop?
A World War I Canadian aviator.
Was he good?
One of the best.
The controversy over the National Film Board's production about Victoria Cross winner Billy Bishop continues to stir up public indignation. I'm standing here in front of the Billy Bishop display at the Canadian War Museum with Cliff Chadderton, Chief Executive Officer of the War Amputations of Canada. Mr. Chadderton, what is the situation now?
We published a digest called Hanging a Legend, which destroys every premise in this National Film Board production of The Kid Who Couldn't Miss. It's had a tremendous reception, and as a matter of fact, that digest is now in its second printing. We've gone over the media response, and so far we haven't found one media person who has in any way suggested that we're not on the right track. In other words, the film destroyed Billy Bishop. I think we're well on the way to restoring his place in Canada's heritage.
What are the chief points you make in the digest published by the War Amputations of Canada?
Well, firstly, we include in the digest 2 reports from eminent historians which point out something like 40 historical inaccuracies in the film. Then, of course, we have to go to the innuendo stage. What the NFB production attempted to do was to say that Billy Bishop landed his aircraft on our own side of the lines, shot some holes in it, took off again, and came back and claimed victory. We have interviewed Mr. Bob Bradford, the director of the National Aviation Museum, who's an expert on World War I aircraft, fighter aircraft, and he states unequivocally that there is no way that anyone could have possibly landed that aircraft by himself. The second scenario that's painted in the NFB film is that Bishop came back without his Lewis gun. And the narrator is suggesting that, well, you know, the only way he could have gotten the Lewis gun off was to land this aircraft and shoot the holes in it and then take off. Again, we have published in the digest technical reports which indicate unequivocally that Bishop, who was an expert, not only an expert airman, but an expert gunnery man, would have had no difficulty at all in taking that Lewis gun off in midair, throwing it overboard, and flying back without it. So those are the 2 main scenarios that the NFB has used in attempting to paint the Bishop as a liar and a cheat and a fraud, and they've just been successfully shot down.
We'd like to show some footage from the NFB film, The Kid Who Couldn't Miss, and we'd like you to comment on these excerpts.
I think that's a great idea.
Yesterday, when I was at the Imperial War Museum, one of the tapes I listened to was by a pilot by the name of A. James. He said that he thought Bishop's record was fraudulent. That Bishop's record was fraudulent. Fraudulent. A fraud.
Oh, yes.
He did not, in fact, have that number of kills. He thought that Bishop was a very ambitious man and was cheating on his kills. And that people, he said it was generally known in the RFC that Bishop was cheating.
What you've just heard is Paul Cowan, the producer, suggesting that there was a tape at the Imperial War Museum made by an Archibald James, and that Archibald James was making comments about everybody knew Bishop was faking his raids. When I went to the Imperial War Museum, firstly, they said, don't take anything serious that Mr. James said. He was well in his 80s, and he's not a credible witness at all. I think that the National Film Board, in using James's tape as one of its cornerstones, is really tampering with history.
The only dark spot is that some members of 60 Squadron are now whispering that Bishop's getting credit for a lot of kills for which there's no confirmation. This is perhaps due to jealousy over Bishop's decorations, but the rumors persist.
Well, here we have it again, the innuendos. What the film says is that there are whispers about Bishop's war record, that he's faking his claims. They have no basis for that. They can't name one person who at that time was giving any kind of whispers about Billy Bishop. In fact, the contrary is true. If you read our digest, you will find reports in there from the people who flew with Bishop. They called him the stunt merchant. They thought he was just the greatest pilot that was in any Air Force anywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, they said he was even greater than von Richthofen. But here we go, a National Film Board suggesting by an innuendo this question of whispers.
Well, I remember, you know, one of the pilots, Carlyle, I mean, he got in a right row with Bishop, you know, about this unconfirmed victories, you know, and, I mean, he was right round a twist with him, you know, and I was surprised because, you know, Carlyle, he was a quiet bloke, but you know, it was all under a lot of pressure.
Now we come to this man, Carlyle. You know, somebody should be strung up for this. You hear Walter Bourne playing the part of Bishop's mechanic, saying that a pilot by the name of Carlyle was criticizing Bishop. You know the truth of the story? We've checked the 60 squadron records.
Meanwhile, the doubts about Bishop are increasing.
You see the sneaky little way they're starting to build their case? Did you get that comment? Meanwhile, the doubts about Bishop are increasing. What doubts? Increasing where? Who said this? No source at all. That's the figment of the imagination of the guy who produced the film.
The offensive patrols had come back. Maybe 6 or 7 machines. They hadn't seen anything, right? Nothing. He goes out a little later by himself, comes back in a couple of hours, you know, he's firing off his flare guns like this bleeding Guy Fawkes thing, claiming he shot down 1, 2, 3 planes. Well, he claimed he shot them down, but it was the CO, it was Major Scott. He's the one who gave it to him.
And here we have Walter Bourne again. And what is he saying? He's saying that the regular patrols go out and find nobody. Bishop goes out on his own and comes back and shoots down 2, 3, or 4 aircraft. Walter Bourne was an actor in this film, playing the part of Billy Bishop's mechanic. There's absolutely no evidence that Walter Bourne ever said anything like that about Billy Bishop. In fact, the evidence is all the other way.
When Bishop did that raid on Estremel that morning, did you have any idea it was coming?
Everybody knew it was coming. I mean, we were up here in Brass Hatch, you know. I mean, they were all standing out in the field, you know, waiting for him to come back, see if he'd done it, you know. I mean, they had everything but a brass band out there, you know. I mean, I thought the king was coming.
Ah, well, now, here we have the narrator saying something about, did you have any idea it's coming? And Bourne again is in the role of saying everybody did, and suggesting that the brass was there waiting for Bishop to come back. Why did they put that scenario in? They're building their case. They're trying to say that the whole raid was a fake, it was a publicity stunt, and that the Army brass, and in fact the British High Command and the government, needed some kind of a raid for publicity purposes. So they were quite prepared to perpetrate a hoax by saying to Bishop, go out and come back and say you shot up a German aircraft, German airdrome, and we'll give you a Victoria Cross. You know, what a travesty of justice to pull down the record and the history of our greatest Victoria Cross, our greatest war hero, on this kind of innuendo. And of course, history records that at that particular time, June the 7th, 1917, there were no brass anywhere near the Files Camp Airport where Bishop flew out of and came back on this famous BC raid.
Later, there will be many doubts about the Estremel raid, although no pilot in 60 Squadron will ever publicly discuss the incident. One of the most baffling questions is why Bishop's Newport returned with its Lewis gun missing.
Well, here we have it again. Later there will be many doubts about the Estramel raid. Just innuendo. For some reason or other, they're building this case against Bishop, all on the basis of there would be many doubts. By whom? They don't say who. It's just, again, as I say, the figment of the imagination of the people who produced this film.
That's a bit of a mystery, you know. I mean, it didn't have its Lewis gun, you know. I mean, he said he chucked it on the way back, you know, to lighten up the plane for added speed, you see. Well, I mean, I'd like to see somebody take one of those off in the air, you know, while flying. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't know, you know, I put them on.
Now they introduce Walter Bourne again as an actor. And what is he saying? He's saying that it's a great mystery about Bishop's Lewis gun. He's saying that, in fact, Bishop came back without his Lewis gun, suggesting that he took it off in midair. And we have Walter Bourne, who, after all, is a skilled mechanic, saying, after all, he puts those Lewis guns on, and that he says, I'd like to see someone take it off in midair. If you read the digest, you'll notice that we've gone to great length to quote the mechanical specifications of the Lewis gun, and there's no question about it. That Lewis gun can be stripped clean in just a little over a minute, and a skilled pilot like Bishop could take it off in midair by just turning a thumb screw and throwing it overboard. But this has to be part of their scenario.
In the accounts of the raid, Bishop's plane is described as returning in tatters. This isn't so.
In the pail, there's about 17 bullet holes, you see, all in a nice little group like that, you know. And, well, I mean, I've seen a lot of planes shot up, but, I mean, nobody can shoot a plane like that, you know. No, quite a mystery.
This is where we deal with the number of bullet holes in the plane. This is crucial. Jack Scott was Billy Bishop's squadron commander. He had to certify what that plane looked like when he wrote up his report of the raid, and he said that this plane was in tatters. And of course, we've already mentioned Bob Bradford. He was our great hero when we did the research, because he is quite prepared to put his reputation on the line as director of the National Aviation Museum, that you just simply cannot land a Newport by yourself and take it off by yourself. You have to have help from ground personnel. So how could Bishop have landed on our side of the lines, shot his plane full of holes, and taken off again? All the experts just say it's just not possible.
Absolutely impossible.
The head of the National Aviation Museum, where a working replica of Bishop's plane is housed, dismisses the NFB's account of the ACE's alleged fraud.
Since the museum has actually flown this airplane, we find it technically impossible to consider that one man could actually land this airplane, either keep the engine idling, which would stand it on its nose as soon as he got out, and break the propeller.
On August the 11th, 1917, Billy Bishop receives his Victoria Cross for the Estramel raid, along with the Distinguished Service Order and Military Cross. The King said the one thing he's always wanted is to give the three awards at the same time, and the King generally gets what he wants.
One is led to wonder how far the moguls at the National Film Board would really go when they will allow this kind of wording in a film, which defames the King of England. That's what it does. It says the King always wanted to give these three medals out at one time, and the King always gets what he wants. Secondly, of course, they're using that, again, to buttress their scenario, that this whole raid was a fake. It was a publicity stunt, and that, in fact, the British High Command, and maybe even the King of England, was in on it. Now, come on, it's absolutely ridiculous.
And they got what they wanted, you know, when they made him a hero. You know, when they put the medals on him, gave him the VC, they got what they wanted. He was ready to die like the rest of them. He was ambitious, but maybe too damn ambitious, I don't know.
And here we have Walter Bourne making his really final comment in the film. And it's a sad, sad comment. He's saying they got what they wanted. And if that isn't a suggestion that the whole raid was faked and that the British High Command and the British government, and as I said, even the King himself, was in on it, I don't know what they expect us to believe from that. They got what they wanted. I can't say anything more about that except that as a veteran and as an amateur historian, I have to express my indignation at that type of innuendo.
What sources did producer Paul Cowan quote in the film?
Very flimsy sources. He went to England and he got in touch with a man by the name of Joe Warren, who is today the historian for 60 Squadron. Joe Warren is known as being anti-bishop. Now, believe it or not, that is about the extent of the research that Paul Cowan did, with one exception. We've mentioned it before. He went to the War Museum and he heard this tape by Archibald James in which he rambled on saying that pilots in Bishop's squadron were sort of suggesting he was faking his raids.
Were there any other sources Cowan used?
None. There's been some suggestion in the film, of course, that the German records were checked and there was no evidence of the raid. That's a total misrepresentation, a total lie. The German records were not checked for the simple reason that the German records were not available. Nobody has been able to find any records for the Esnes airport or the Estromel airport or whichever one he raided, Billy Bishop raided. No one has been able to find those records. So how in the blazes can somebody say they checked the records and they found no indication that the raid had been carried out?
What sources have you and the war amps been able to uncover?
Well, I think this is where the preponderance of evidence comes in. Let's start with Billy Bishop himself. Billy Bishop wrote a book in 1917 when he was home in Canada on marriage leave. And that book was called Winged Victory. And it is a first-hand account of what Bishop had done. If you read the book, it's not the words of a braggart, quite the opposite. It's the words of a very self-effacing man who is sort of sloughing it all off and saying, well, this is what I did, but, you know, I shot this fellow down and I shot that fellow down. Next, we come to Jack Scott. Jack Scott was a leading barrister in London. He was Bishop's commanding officer. In 1919, he wrote a book called 60 Squadron, which historians suggest is a very accurate record of what took place. Now, 13 years later, and by this time, if anyone had any doubts, they would have seeped into the public consciousness. 13 years later, George Drew, who later became the Premier of Ontario and the leader of the opposition in the Canadian government, he wrote a book called Canada's Fighting Airmen. He had absolutely no question about Bishop's record except to say that he did not get credit for all of the planes that he shot down. And when it comes to confirmation of this raid, George Drew says, oh yes, it was confirmed by interrogating captured German prisoners. Now we come to the 30s. All the way through in the 30s, you go to magazines like Popular Flying and Popular Aviation, which were published in the States and in Canada. And Billy Bishop was a hero. He was right next to the Red Baron, to von Richthofen. And there must be, and we've published some of them in our digest, there must be 25 or 30 articles written, all sort of suggesting who was the greatest ace of all, Billy Bishop. Now let's come right to present time. Cowan did this film in 1981. In 1982, Robert Jackson, who is one of the noted air historians in the United Kingdom, wrote a new book. And that book is called The RAF from Flanders to the Falklands, covers the whole spectrum. Jackson has no qualms about Bishop's place in history. He devotes a whole chapter to Billy Bishop and again calls him the greatest ace on the British side from World War I. If you want to research American reading, their greatest air historian, writer, is a fellow named Joseph Phelan. Now, Joseph wrote a book in 1982 called Planes and Pilots of World War I. Joe Phelan has absolutely no question about Billy Bishop's record. Canadians have been reading a book by Pierre Burton called Bimmy. Right in the opening part of that book, Pierre Burton talks about Billy Bishop and about his place in history and about what he did. And I suggest that if you want to compare Pierre Burton as a historian up against Paul Cowan and his people, his so-called researchers at the Film Board, it's an unfair contest. Everyone knows that Burton is an absolute expert. Ken Molson, who's again one of our leading aeronautical experts in Canada, has quite a bit to say about Bishop in his book, which deals partly with aircraft of World War I and partly with Bishop's record. So you can run the whole gamut. Every possible thing that you will read, going right back to 1917, about Billy Bishop is all 100% positive.
Is there a lot of confusion in the film?
I defy anyone to watch this film and know whether they're looking at fact or fantasy. It's a composite. It's made up of actual interviews. It's made up of interviews with actors. It's made up of archival footage, and not very much of that. It's made up of footage from Hollywood World War I movies. And I think finally, the film producer has used this marvelous technique of innuendo by putting words in the mouth of someone off camera who's called a narrator. He's not identified. And he's given the license in this film to say all kinds of things which are never proved at all, you know, such as by now pilots in Bishop's squadron are wondering whether his record is valid and that type of thing. And I think that's what's really wrong with the whole film, is that there's a disclaimer at the start that says this is a docudrama. That doesn't really mean anything anyway, unless you want to say that a docudrama should be true and some parts of it should be dramatized. However, going beyond the disclaimer at the start, then you get into all sorts of footage and interviews. And you never know whether you're looking at actual footage, you never know whether you're looking at... There's one shot in there of a Hollywood actor, I think it's Clark Gable, sitting at the controls of an aircraft going down in flames. Are we supposed to see that kind of thing in a docudrama, and one that destroys the record of our greatest hero from World War I? Oh yes, the whole film can be summed up in one word: confusion.
Mr. Chadderton, what happens next?
Well, we're not sure. The digest, as I say, is in its second printing. My mail basket is overflowing. The Canadian public have finally taken a very real interest in this. And every letter that I have gotten has been just full of indignation about this film. The public is picking that up, not only from our digest, but from what was said in the media before. And I sense a real groundswell out there. What happens next? Firstly, I don't think the Canadian Parliament will deal with this, and I don't think the Canadian Parliament should deal with it. You see, if Parliament stepped in and barred this film, that would be censorship. I am totally against that. Censorship is something on grounds of moral or religious or political or military grounds. This film should be withdrawn, not on any of those grounds. Should be withdrawn on the grounds of inaccuracies. People can see the film, they can get the script. On the other hand, they can see what we've had to say about it in the digest, and as we say in our own digest, draw your own conclusions. We don't make any conclusions. We simply put all the evidence in front of you. But we cannot stand by and see taxpayers' money and a government agency destroying the record of our greatest war hero. Because there's another point. If we allow them to do that, who do they attack next? And maybe it sounds a little far-fetched, and maybe I'm speaking from my point of view as a veteran, but I think that this film is an indignity against every man who ever served and every woman who ever served his or her country. Because what it is really saying, and what Cowan stated before the Senate committee, was that he wanted to examine how heroes were made. Well, heroes aren't made. Medals are earned because somebody went beyond the cause of duty. And the second question, he said, was he wanted to explore why a country needed heroes anyway. We don't need heroes. In the last two wars and in the conflict in Korea, Canadians went. They went because they felt that there was some danger to their way of life. And I don't think a possibility of earning a medal, if you like, has anything to do with that at all. And so I suggest that in another area, this film is really a severe criticism of the total military effort of this country.
One is Billy Bishop, as a result of the film produced by the National Film Board, which has exercised a great many people. I suppose it's still out there circulating, but in effect it suggested that Bishop wasn't the brave victor that he was portrayed, that there was a lot that was phony about his Victoria Cross. Is there anything in all the work you did that would undermine the original thesis that was held for so many years, that we had a genuine brave hero in Billy Bishop?
Nothing whatsoever. I soaked myself in Bishop when that book was being written. We have in National Defense all his combat reports, plus a good deal of his correspondence. I think Bishop is perhaps a far more complex character than came through in George Drew's book on Canada's Fighting Airmen. But in terms of the skill and courage and enterprise of this man, I simply have no doubt. I thought that the particular film to which you refer, The Kid Who Couldn't Miss, was a sleazy piece of glitz.
I would add something to that if I can. I happened to be at the Public Record Office in England at Tring, where it used to be in Oxfordshire. I think it was a Buckinghamshire, where it said was Hertfordshire. We were working on the combat records together at that time. And I can remember at the end of day after day was said reading for 8 hours nothing but combat reports and being totally exhausted because you're living through such hell for 8 hours, recreating it, saying there are few who stand out in these combat reports. They were the ones who followed each one down to the ground, and Bishop was leading among those people.